After the Knights Templar officially received recognition for their order in 1129, they worked diligently, combining monasticism with chivalry. 10 years later, in 1139, Pope Innocent II issued the papal bull known as the Donation of Perfection, granting the Templars special privileges, including exemption from taxes, and absolving them from local laws or any authority other than the Pope himself. This greatly increased their financial power, and their branches spread throughout Europe. They built castles and cathedrals, established an investment network that dominated the economy of medieval Europe, and were even described as the first capitalists. They became a power within a power, or in modern terms, like a lobby with influence on decision makers. However, the main source of their wealth remained a question. It was illogical for donations alone to create such a vast financial empire. Yet the central question remained: what was the true source of this immense wealth? It was hardly plausible that donations alone could have forged such a vast financial empire, even with the presence of shadowy investments and covert business deals that secured an unprecedented degree of financial influence in European history. This opens the door to compelling hypotheses. Could some of this wealth trace its origins to a mysterious legacy? And do the Knights Templar still have spiritual heirs orchestrating events from behind the scenes? Militarily, they remained an elite force in the Crusader army, legendary for their bravery, until Saladin crushed their strength, and they fell like autumn leaves under the hooves of the Muslim cavalry at the Battle of Hattin in 1187. Some managed to flee alongside the Crusaders to Tyre and then to Acre, where they later moved their headquarters. Before this, however, they had found what they were searching for beneath Al-Aqsa. Though not definitively proven, many indications suggest that the Templars were deeply interested in searching for religious artifacts, and their mission to protect the pilgrims was likely a cover for systematic and methodical excavation operations based on a plan drawn for them by their deity. Indeed, they are believed to have found something that later became the subject of stories mixing fact and fiction. After the liberation of Jerusalem, Saladin entered the city on October 2, 1187, bringing an end to Crusader dominance in the east. The Crusaders were left with only Antioch, Tripoli, and Tyre, where the defeated Crusaders had fled. King Lusignan of Jerusalem also sought refuge there, after being pardoned by Saladin. The news of the Muslims' consecutive victories hit the Christian world like a thunderclap, and the liberation of Jerusalem caused a massive shock to the Europeans, who believed that Jerusalem was the kingdom of heaven granted to them by God and that they were the rightful rulers. However, God had forsaken them for some reason, allowing it to slip from their hands. Even the Knights Templar were not immune to this psychological blow, and it is said that it led to a radical ideological shift for them, from belief in God to the worship of Satan. However, some theories suggest that this ideological shift may have preceded the official founding of the organization itself. According to certain accounts, the seeds of this doctrinal deviation were sown during the earliest stages of recruitment and formation, when individuals from obscure backgrounds, possibly linked to ancient pagan rituals and secret traditions prevalent in the East during the Crusades, were drawn into the ranks. Some researchers propose that during their extended stay in Jerusalem, the Knights Templar engaged in arcane studies and clandestine excavations beneath the Temple Mount, where they are believed to have discovered esoteric texts and manuscripts. These writings allegedly contained elements of dark magic and the worship of shadowy entities, which profoundly altered their worldview and conception of the divine. As a result, they became immersed in a complex symbolic system where religious tenets intersected with occult knowledge, and public allegiance was overshadowed by hidden loyalties. Pope Urban III collapsed and died upon hearing the news of the Muslim victory at Hattin. He was succeeded by Gregory VIII, who declared that the Muslim capture of Jerusalem was a punishment from God for the Christians due to their sins. He then called for the Third Crusade to reclaim the Holy Land. Meanwhile, the Crusaders who had gathered in Tyre united their ranks and headed to Acre, where they laid siege for 2 full years. Just as Peter the Hermit had once ridden his donkey to stir public anger and call for participation in the First Crusade, Catholic clergymen now traveled through markets, stirring emotions and encouraging people to defend Christian holy sites desecrated by the Muslims. England and France put aside their historical differences and ended the ongoing war between them in preparation to face the Muslims. King Henry II of England and King Philip II of France imposed a tax on their people known as the Saladin tithe, requiring 10% of wealth and property to fund preparations for the Third Crusade. The German Emperor, Frederick I Barbarossa, also joined the campaign. Thus, 3 of the greatest kings of Europe prepared for the Crusade, earning it the title of the Crusade of Kings. Frederick Barbarossa led a large army, marching through Hungary toward Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire at the time. The Byzantine Emperor, Isaac II Angelos, sent word to Saladin, promising that he would not allow the German army to pass. His aim was to avoid confronting the strength of the Muslim army and to maintain the sacred sites in the Levant under the protection of the Orthodox Church, rather than allowing them to fall under the rule of the Western Catholic Church. But after the Germans besieged Constantinople, the Byzantine emperor was forced to allow Frederick's army to cross the Dardanelles and continue their march through Anatolia until they reached Iconium. However, Frederick died along the way, and much of the army returned to the Holy Roman Empire, while his son led the remainder of the forces toward Antioch and then to Acre via Tyre. Meanwhile, the English and French armies prepared to march eastward. However, before the English army could set off, Henry II of England passed away, and his son Richard I, known by the name Richard the Lionheart, succeeded him on the throne of England. Richard led the fleet of the Crusade across the Mediterranean Sea to support the siege of Acre. On the way, the English besieged the island of Cyprus, which had separated from the Byzantine Empire, and seized it. Instead of returning it to the Byzantine Empire, Richard sold it to the Knights Templar. In the summer of 1191, after a prolonged siege and tightening the noose on the city both by land and sea, the Crusaders managed to capture Acre. Richard then continued his march to Jaffa and sent word to Saladin, requesting a meeting to sign an agreement between them. Saladin refused to meet until Richard agreed to a peace treaty that would end the campaign and free the Muslim prisoners. When Richard refused and ordered the execution of 2,700 prisoners, Saladin's army confronted the Crusaders at Arsuf, north of Jaffa. However, Richard's military acumen led to a crushing defeat for the Muslims, and the Crusaders took control of Jaffa. Saladin then retreated to fortify Jerusalem. Richard's desire to meet with Saladin stemmed from the unstable political situation in England at the time. Some historians have mentioned that King Richard harbored animosity toward the Jews and ordered massacres against them. While this has not been definitively proven, behind the scenes, plots were being hatched against him, similar to what would later happen with Hitler centuries afterward. Richard felt that his throne was in jeopardy and thus reluctantly entered negotiations with Saladin, with negotiations being led on the Muslim side by King Aladil. However, the initial negotiations failed, and the Crusaders continued their march toward Jerusalem. But when news from England reached Richard that his brother John Lackland was conspiring against him, he was forced to sign a treaty with Saladin, known as the Treaty of Ramla, in 1192. The main provisions of the treaty stated that Jerusalem would remain under Muslim rule, while Christian merchants and pilgrims would be allowed to visit the city. In return, the Crusaders retained control of the coastal cities, Tyre, Acre, Haifa, Caesarea, Arsuf, and Jaffa. Thus, the Third Crusade ended with a result that was unsatisfactory for both sides. Despite the Crusade's success in capturing Acre and Jaffa, it failed to achieve its primary goal of reclaiming Jerusalem. Meanwhile, the Islamic world was disappointed by Saladin's failure to retain control over the coastal cities, which allowed the Crusaders to re-establish their foothold in the east along the coast from Tyre to Jaffa, in addition to Tripoli and Antioch. In the following year, 1193, King Saladin fell ill and passed away shortly after. The rule of the Ayyubid state was divided among his successors. His eldest son, al-Afdal al-Din, ruled Damascus, Jerusalem, and Baalbek. His son, al-Aziz Osman, ruled Egypt. His third son, al-Zahir Ghazi, ruled Aleppo and northern Syria. As for his brother, King Al-Adil, he ruled Jordan, Kerak, Jazira, and Diyarbakir. The remaining parts of the state were distributed among his other children, brothers, and family members. However, they soon entered into conflicts driven by ambitions, and they kept attacking each other until King Al-Adil was able to firmly seize control and reunite the Ayyubid state under his rule. He enlisted the help of his sons in administering it, appointing his son Al-Kamil Muhammad in Egypt, Al-Muazzam Isa in Damascus, and Al-Ashraf Musa in Haran. Meanwhile, Leopold V, Duke of Austria, had captured Richard the Lionheart and later released him for a large ransom. Richard returned to England in 1194 and eventually died in 1199. Throughout these years, the Christian world remained dissatisfied with the outcome of the Third Crusade, which prompted Pope Innocent III to call for a Fourth Crusade in 1202 to achieve the goal that the Third Crusade had failed to accomplish. As Europe watched with growing unease the aftermath of the Third Crusade, fractures began to emerge within the Crusader camp itself, triggering conflicts among the competing European powers. Amid this climate of political and military disarray, the Knights Templar seized the opportunity to expand their influence. They capitalized on the prevailing instability to strengthen their position, increasing their presence across the Crusader states and deepening their alliances with local and feudal powers. Bolstered by substantial financial support from Europe and an extensive transnational network, the Templars gradually evolved from a purely religious military order into a formidable economic and intelligence force that commanded strategic consideration across Christendom. At this time, the Knights Templar had moved their headquarters from Jerusalem to Acre. And while their military power in the east had weakened, their economic power grew significantly in the west. However, the same question continued to echo. What was the source of their vast wealth? Neither the donations nor their skill in financial management could explain how they had transformed from an organization symbolized by two knights riding one horse, signifying poverty, into an organization that could lend to kings and princes. Although this question remains unanswered to this day, most suspicions point to the fact that they discovered a hidden treasure beneath the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which was the key to their rise and their dramatic fall. It is said that they discovered the Shroud of Turin, the cloth in which Jesus Christ was wrapped after his crucifixion, according to their belief. However, this piece of cloth, which has been preserved since 1578 in the Cathedral of San Giovanni in Turin, Italy, underwent independent carbon-14 tests in 1988, and researchers dated it to between 1260 and 1390, meaning it does not belong to the time of Jesus Christ. Believers, however, defended its authenticity, arguing that it had undergone restoration at some point. It is also said that they discovered the Holy Grail, which, according to Christian mythology, is the cup used by Jesus Christ during the Last Supper when he gathered with his disciples before his arrest and crucifixion. It is said that during this meeting, he instituted what is known as the Eucharist, or the Holy Communion, one of the 7 sacred rites, the teachings and rituals that aim to obtain an invisible grace through a visible grace. The importance of the Holy Grail lies in the belief that it holds miraculous powers derived from Christ himself, as it is believed to have contained his blood. Although this fascinating story resembles the legends of the Celtic peoples who lived in Central Europe during the Iron Age, the Holy Grail has an even more intriguing story. The third and perhaps most enigmatic discovery attributed to the Knights Templar is the teachings known as the Kabbalah. This is a mystical and esoteric Judaic system concerned with interpreting the universe, the divine, and creation through deeply symbolic and metaphysical lenses, radically different from traditional religious doctrines. It is believed that these teachings were once preserved in secret manuscripts, passed down orally among a select circle of priests and sages, until it fell into the hands of the Templars during their time in Jerusalem. For the Templars, the encounter with Kabbalistic knowledge was a profound intellectual and spiritual shock. It opened gateways to concepts they had never encountered before: the higher realms, the secret names of God, parallel universes, and the laws of energy and manifestation. Over time, it is said that some members of the order adopted these mystical ideas as part of a new esoteric doctrine, gradually distancing themselves from Orthodox Catholic beliefs and engaging in spiritual and magical practices deemed heretical by the Church. Some historians argue that the Templars' engagement with the Kabbalah went beyond theoretical exploration and was transformed into practical elements embedded in their rituals, eventually becoming one of the foundational pillars that nourished later European secret societies, such as the Illuminati and Freemasonry. Pope Innocent III succeeded in launching the Fourth Crusade, and the armies were prepared to head east with the aim of recovering Jerusalem from Muslim hands. It seems that the leaders of the Crusade recognized that the power of the Muslims lay within the Ayyubid state, and the center of gravity for this state was Egypt. Therefore, the path to Jerusalem must begin with the overthrow of the Ayyubids at their stronghold, followed by the establishment of Egypt as a base for launching into the Levant. However, this crusade took a strange turn. Instead of heading to Egypt, the Crusaders besieged the city of Zadra in 1202, a Catholic Christian city located on the Adriatic coast within present-day Croatia. After capturing it, widespread killings and looting ensued. The crusade then moved to Constantinople to support the Byzantine Emperor Isaac II Angelos against his brother, who had deposed him and declared himself emperor. They restored Isaac to the throne, and his son, Alexios IV Angelos, became the de facto ruler. He had promised the Crusaders a financial reward in exchange for their support. When he failed to honor this promise, the Crusaders seized Constantinople in 1204, looted it, and committed mass killings against its inhabitants. This incited outrage among the Christian world, as comparisons were drawn between the actions of the Crusaders against their fellow Christians and what Saladin had done after the liberation of Jerusalem, where its inhabitants, including the leaders and fighters, were allowed to leave safely. The Crusaders settled in Constantinople and divided the Byzantine Empire into 3 empires, while also establishing a fourth. This sparked wars between them and the Bulgarians and Byzantines, which lasted until 1261, when the Byzantine Empire regained its status. However, these conflicts weakened the Byzantine Empire, paving the way for its eventual conquest by the Muslims nearly 2 centuries later. Although the Fourth Crusade strayed from its primary objective and deepened the Great Schism between the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Western Catholic Church, the successors of Saladin, who divided the Ayyubid state between Egypt, Syria, and Iraq, remained divided and conflicted among themselves. Pope Innocent III recognized that the Islamic State was in a state of weakness and fragmentation, so he hastily called for a Fifth Crusade in 1213 to achieve the same goal that the Fourth Crusade had failed to reach, the recovery of Jerusalem. However, Innocent III died before the crusade could begin, and he was succeeded by Honorius III. In 1217, a large crusader army gathered in Acre, which included the Knights Hospitaller and the Knights Templar. In the following year, 1218, the Crusaders arrived at Damietta and laid siege to it for a year and a half. Sultan al-Kamil made a strange offer to the Crusaders. He would lift the siege on Damietta in exchange for the surrender of Jerusalem. However, the Pope's representative, who was essentially the supreme commander of the Crusader forces, arrogantly rejected the offer, declaring that there could be no peace with the infidels and that they must occupy Damietta and all of Egypt. And in 1219, the Crusaders successfully occupied Damietta, and as usual, they brutally killed its inhabitants and looted the city. They then continued their march toward Mansoura. Sultan al-Kamil continued to offer the Crusaders a deal to leave Egypt in exchange for the surrender of Jerusalem, despite it being a symbol of the conflict. However, they repeatedly rejected it arrogantly until the annual Nile flood occurred. The bridges were opened, and the roads were flooded. Meanwhile, Sultan al-Kamil allied with his brothers, Al-Muazzam Isa and Al-Ashraf Musa, and the Muslim army laid siege to the Crusaders, cutting off their route of retreat and isolating them from their base in Damietta. Faced with these developments, the Crusaders had no choice but to surrender. The crusade withdrew to Damietta and then returned to Europe, dragging the shame of failure.